I'm really here today to set the table on what the view from the Brink looks like and really why we're here. We're going to begin today with an overview of US and Chinese industrial policy playbooks, and in particular, how they vary fundamentally in their scope, scale, and consistency. Thereafter, the show really begins because we're going to see how these playbooks have unfolded, are unfolding, and will unfold in real time. We'll look at the solar industry, we'll look at batteries, and then we'll look at the chip sector. Finally, we're going to take a look at where we are and where we might want to be and how it's all connected across various policy silos. So, ready to get started, everyone? Excellent. Okay, so China's industrial policy playbook. I have a set of 6 S's that kind of encapsulate China's industrial policies. Set, shelter, subsidize, steal, subvert, and sell. So first, mahjong tiles. China sets specific goals and targets for what it determines to be priority sectors. Examples include the plenipotentiary of 5-year plans, State Council's decisions on strategic and emerging industries, as well as Made in China 2025. Next, the CCP shelters its infant industries from markets and from competition. They implement domestic market protection policies, including high tariffs and unequal standards for importers, limit foreign investment, and so on and so on. Sheltering nascent industries also occurs through targets set for localization, market penetration of Chinese firms, and productivity. Third, on the list is to subsidize these target industries directly through a variety of payment systems, such as R&D funding, and indirectly by providing below-market loans, allowing SOEs and Chinese firms operating in target industry supply chains to skirt environmental regulations through environmental arbitrage, and by using sub-market and forced labor. And finally, by providing free or below-market inputs such as land and energy. Subsidies are also transferred to the consumer in the form of below-market rebates and prices furnished to the government at all levels. Concurrently, Chinese firms, often the government itself, is encouraged to acquire or outright steal foreign technologies and innovate upon them. This is done by establishing strategic investments in foreign firms. It's done by engaging in state-led industrial espionage and cyber theft. It's executed around an entire regime built to support forced technology transfer, including through things like joint venture requirements. Next, China subverts fair competition in their domestic market and in international markets. After stealing and subsidizing has provided these Chinese technologies with a toehold in global markets, they subvert competition through the variety of these non-market strategies, including setting targets for market share, undermining competitors through predatory pricing, dumping, and overcapacity, making strategic investments in adjacent industries and critical infrastructure in key markets, and engaging in economic coercion and intimidation. China also opens its markets with low standard market agreements while ignoring any inconvenient treaty obligation or international commitments that they've made. Any casual observer of China can see that they often make international commitments with no intention of keeping their end of the bargain. Finally, once China has near control of the market, they sell everywhere at a price of their choosing. All right, let's take a look at the United States now. We do things a little bit differently. The US approach can be summarized as limited or sporadic intervention and respect for rules, and particularly respect for the rule of law. There is a triad of policies and non-policies that we include in our approach that facilitate growth of US industries. And we also have a legal and regulatory framework that is underpinned with this philosophy, and as well as our approach to innovation also is philosophically consistent. So until recently, the US government had a tacit prohibition on industrial policy. During my tenure at the Commerce Department, the words industrial policy were dirty words, and you were not allowed to do anything that targeted a specific industry or really prized one industry or the other. There was this concept of industry neutrality. So one of the first things the US does in order to not do industrial policy is to not tie aid. We spend a lot of money on foreign aid, but we have no formal ties in US government-backed investments to US technologies or economic interests. We also maintain low domestic barriers to trade without any sort of express policy around reciprocity, regardless of what the policies are of the government we're working with. And we also enact trade remedies only when there is really egregious evidence of injury and where executive discretion is concerned in trade remedies, when the political winds are favorable to any given administration. Furthermore, we limit export promotion budgets. We prefer that U.S. companies pay their own way into foreign markets. Next, competition and underpinned by the rule of law. We prefer markets, we prefer competition, but we like good rules, right? So this is obvious in the ways that we use market pricing, and that market pricing in the United States is complemented by a whole system of antitrust laws that prevent things like cartel pricing and unnatural monopolies. We sporadically seek high standard trade agreements with friends and allies. Furthermore, our government will form domestic rules and policies to be consistent with our international obligations. If you don't believe me, spend one day working on fisheries policies at USTR. That was for you guys. We enforce our domestic labor and environmental standards. We maintain a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Good practice follows you wherever you go when you are an American, and I would argue that that's a good thing. All right, innovation systems. Our innovation system is bifurcated between the private sector and the government. But those goals are distinct. The private sector innovates to maximize profit, which is also arguably a good thing. But the government does not necessarily consider economic security interests in our innovation system. Most of our public innovation system is built around our policy interests, right? So R&D funding is going to focus on things like health, environment, security, and really have a focus on dissemination of technologies that can lead to those outcomes. The federal government funds innovation grants, but they don't necessarily typically fund commercializations. Unlike the CCP, the U.S. considers the intellectual property rights system to be an important catalyst for both innovation and value creation. We protect both our companies and the world's IP at home. We generally like to de-risk investments through loan programs rather than subsidies. We like to use the market. And our export controls, in terms of letting domestic innovation leak past our borders, we limit export controls and CFIUS reviews to national security considerations only. And finally, we even allow for the foreign purchase of publicly developed technologies. We are happy to onshore the R&D costs and to make those public while offshoring the resulting manufacturing jobs. Okay, so if we look at these, obviously, there's a lot of unfair things that China does that, in fact, is like a finger on the scale, right? But it is effective in terms of lowering costs and tilting that scale in their advantage. Now, however, I'd like to note that many of the US tools and approaches, such as tying aid, maintaining low domestic import barriers without reciprocity, amount to our own finger on the scale, forcing it in China's column. Yeah. Okay. The other thing to know about China is it is a system. They have an industrial policy scaffolding, and it's not accidental. It's highly intentional. So Independent from our moral and philosophical differences, the cardinal difference is that China's ability to build a framework or scaffolding to support their industrial aspirations and to execute on that framework effectively. This is evidenced in its 5-year plans, its strategic emerging industries decision, its science and technology plans, in Made in China 2025, and through approaches such as the IDAR opinions on technology acquisition. IDAR stands for introducing, digesting, absorbing, and re-innovating. And I'm just going to spend a quick minute on IDAR because I think it's really important to understand how it works. First, introduce. Target and acquire foreign technology through acquisition and investment. Then, digest. The government and private sector share information on technologies and its potential uses. Absorb. The CCP and the Chinese industry collaborate to develop products, including government financial assistance to commercialize and promote those products. Re-innovate. Improve upon foreign technology, and which is actually really easy if you don't care about intellectual property rights and you can share it across domains, right? In the United States, if you are a company and you want to innovate, you have to acquire IP and actually pay for it because it's someone's property, which also is a good thing. Sorry about that. Okay. So if we look at the scale of industrial policy spending, it's pretty mind-boggling. In 2019, China outpaces the overall scale of industrial policy spending, both in percent and in absolute terms. They spend about 1.5% of their GDP, or $212 billion a year on industrial policy spending, where the US spends just a little under 40.4% of its GDP on industrial policy spending at around $84 billion. Also, when it comes to market access, again, China beats the United States in overall scale. The US, through its FTAs, has $10.2 trillion of market access, while China has $14.4 trillion of market access. And this is excluding BRI and AGOA for both parties. Now, what is interesting about China is their market access it constitutes $9.7 trillion in fast-growing markets that the US does not have market access with. We do not have an agreement with these countries, especially in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, that really, really matter. If you look at the lighter market access commitments, such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the US's AGOA Act, China still has far more regional market access. Where China can access many more markets than the United States, it still maintains high internal trade barriers. The average most favored nation tariff in China is 7.5%, where the average tariff is roughly half of that in the United States of 3.3%. So it is very easy to sell to us. It is very hard for us to sell to others. Okay, so moving on to our specific case studies. Act 1, The Ghost of Christmas Past, the story of solar. All right, so just a quick look at the solar supply chain. All right, we'll take a look. It has the rough, the four main components of most manufactured supply chains, which is mined products, refining and processing, component manufacturing, and product manufacturing. Key components include wafers, solar-grade glass, and cells, and final products include modules and inverters. All right, so taking a look at how who dominates this supply chain. In the mined products category, China has a very serious toehold, but does not completely control the mining sector, unless you look at their investments, and then they do. Refining and processing, China dominates, and on component manufacturing, there is near total domination. 97% of solar wafers are produced in China. 80% of the inverters. Those inverters have code. You can turn out the lights if you mess with the inverters. Just to harken back to our conversation yesterday about infrastructure and industrial espionage. China has its own solar scaffolding. It's extremely well developed. Those include things like government-sanctioned IP theft, manufacturing subsidies, feed-in tariffs that are below market and below other energy sources, free land, free energy, grants for the importation of solar manufacturing equipment. That was a very serious early move that China made. All right. So if we look at this over time, I think this is a really interesting sort of comparison of these policy approaches. So the CCP support for solar has been abundant, and more importantly, it's been consistent. It has been continuous. In the contrast, U.S. support financed through Title 17 loan guarantees under ERA that occurred through 2009 and 2012 did in fact lead to an uptick in U.S. manufacturing capacity. Like if you see the middle dark blue line, that is per year by gigawatt annually manufacturing capacity in the solar sector. So from 2009 to 2011, when shovels were supposed to be in the ground, you had a jump from very little manufacturing capacity to about 2.4 gigawatts. But you'll see over time that there was very little, that there was while there was an incline in capacity, there was a decline in utilization in the United States. Was there overcapacity in the US? No, there was overcapacity in China. So because of dumping and subsidization, the US enacts trade remedies after a certain number of years of evidence, but you see there is still a lot of circumvention. And right at the time, if you look at the 2015, 2016, and 2017 period, right at the time when capacity is going down in the United States and it's matching utilization is when our solar installations, which is the light blue in the back, take off. So we built all that capacity, it declined because we couldn't compete, and now, right when we should be installing our own panels, because we're the ones who invented them, the installations take off. A Solar 201 safeguard deals with the circumvention, but it is only a 4-year program, right? So it's limited in duration. We have Section 301 tariffs that are highly effective, and you see manufacturing pickup. We have the Uyghur Force Protection Labor Act, and more importantly, the IRA, which, if you look at the Title 17 loans under ERA, IRA is that on steroids. So we have another massive investment in this in energy and public infrastructure. The question is, what are we going to do to protect ourselves better of the second time around? Now, 1 year of subsidies, it doesn't look good so far. China spends about $6.5 billion a year on solar subsidies. The US just $1.4 billion. And this leads to real competitive differences in manufacturing solar products. So the overhead costs are about 28% greater in the United States. This is due to lack of compliance cost. If you don't have to do any environmental controls, you don't have to write in any sort of paperwork to tell your environmental official that you're following the rules. Benefits of corruption also lead to real overhead cost benefits. Depreciation is 2.5 times greater in the United States. This is again about a result of things like environmental non-compliance, just like cheaper to do things dirty, and that has real costs around the cost of capital, lower investment costs overall, and below market investment costs. This creates over time for a project a depreciation dividend because you pay depreciation over time, right? So that's a baked-in benefit. Manufacturing labor is 3 times higher in the United States due to forced labor and below market labor practices, and as well as currency manipulation. So even when we're taking subsidies into account, China has significantly lower production costs than the United States for module production. The US is about 19 cents per watt, while China produces it at about 11 cents per watt. Okay, another timeline, real-time impact of China's industrial policies. If we look at China's outward investments in clean energy and in alternative energy, not just solar, but wind and others. You look at 2011, there's a huge jump in investment. This is the jumping off point for IDAR. This is when they are investing, and then the darker sections show basically the US, North America, Europe, Australia, our allies, and then our sphere of influence in South America. So for a few years, between 2011 and 2015, there's a lot of investment in Western companies. And then you see this shift to installation around 2016 once that toehold has been established. The projects go from investment in joint ventures in local solar companies to building big solar farms and installing. And if we look at China's exports laid over this investment information, you see that their exports skyrocket just about the time they start investing in big projects overseas. Nothing here is accidental. What does the future look like? Well, I have bad news. It's bleak. The International Energy Agency predicts that by 2030, China's module manufacturing will be 108% of total world demand. So everything after China is overcapacity. Okay, shifting to the ghost of Christmas present. The opportunity to catch up on batteries. Batteries are critically important for national security, for climate security, and for economic security. So let's take a look at where we're at in this sector, all right? Same deal in terms of the supply chain. Key components include cathodes, anodes, and electrolyte solution, as well as the cell itself. And if we look at supply chain dominance, it's going to feel very familiar. Is anybody else seeing red? Okay. All right, again, a determined policy scaffolding, but one that is less developed than the solar scaffolding. So we've had a lot of time on solar. Batteries, you see, is just starting to get cooking around 2009, and in recent years, there's an uptick in these battery-focused policies. So we still have time to think about what we're going to do to counter these moves. If we take a look at EV sales overlaid on these policies, we can see that, again, extremely consistent. And comparatively, around 2020, China has this big jump in EV sales. The most recent year, China sold 10.1 million EVs, the US just 1.7. Okay, so critical component for those batteries. And if you look at China's lithium-ion battery exports, again, around 2020, they jump because they have done all the background work that they need to do to completely dominate the global supply chain. Once again, industrial subsidies for batteries, $12.4 billion annually on the Chinese side, and a 25% import tariff on new energy vehicles. Impossible to sell a vehicle into China. The US, just $4 billion, and laughably, because it's just moving a decimal point, a 2.5% tariff on EVs. Okay, but there is some good news. The US, is, due to tax credits, has edged ahead on labor costs in the battery sector, as has created a narrow competitive advantage. However, materials are still 40% cheaper in China due to things like subsidies, general shenanigans, and a near total capture of the value chain. And again, even when subsidies are taken into account, there are significantly lower production costs for battery packs in China. What does the future look like? In 2030, China's battery manufacturing capacity accounts for 77% of annual demand. All right, the ghost of Christmas future. Are we going to be able to win when the chips are down? Chips supply chain is a little bit different. It has three distinct layers: refining and processing, design, and then fabrication and assembly, testing, and packaging. Now, we see that there is actually some good news for the United States in the design area. We dominate there. We're the leader. And with Korea just behind us. And But we see China sort of edging forward on fabrication, assembling, testing, and packaging. And even though the US has invested in the CHIPS Act, the Chinese government has historically been providing billions of support in this industry through all sorts of industry policies with the stated goal of becoming independent in these technologies. The US is using export control measures to prevent China from gaining access to the most advanced chips and manufacturing equipment, which has left the door open for China to double down on its efforts to become a global leader in the foundational or mature node chips. We don't say mature. It's like when people call me mature, it hurts my feelings. All right, so if you look at these, at the foundational chips here, fabrication and manufacturing capacity between major producers between 2022 and what we anticipate for 2026. China jumps a full 1 million wafers of capacity a month between 2022 and 2026. That is a major leap. And if you kind of harken back to our solar slide you saw early in the solar development process, there was a lot of grants and subsidies for the importation of solar manufacturing equipment. This is a graph of China's semiconductor manufacturing equipment imports. It is a pattern, and you see this massive uptick in their importation of this equipment. CHIPS policy through the big fund phases 1 and 2, Made in China roadmap in particular is starting to gain steam. And if we look at semiconductor manufacturing, while the US is on the decline, China is on the upcline. The upcline, that's not a real thing, the incline, sorry. All right. So we've seen this movie before, and so we've recently had very massive public investments to ramp up our own capabilities. But the question is it going to be enough, and can we move fast enough to catch up? Taking a quick look at industrial policy spending, albeit pre-CHIPS Act. I want to be clear, this is before the CHIPS Act influence has entered the data. Without that, we spend about 1.5 or 10 to 15% of the cost of a plant on subsidies, while China doubles that in around 30 to 35%. Our MFN tariff is 0%, but fortunately, we have a 301 tariff on chips of 23%. But we have to remember that most chips come into our market not as a chip, but in a cell phone or a computer or a microwave or a car. China's MFN tariff rate is actually fairly low still. And I think that there's some strategic reasons why that's the case, because they can shuffle back and forth pretty easily between Taiwan and other South Korea and other chip producing markets. All right. The 10-year cost of ownership of an advanced logic fab, the pre-CHIPS Act for the United States is scaled to 100% in this graph. China is just 72%. Prior to CHIPS Act effects, China is about a little bit more than 25% cheaper. Okay, so now we're getting to the exciting part. What are we going to do about all of these things, and how do they relate with each other? So if we look at some of the things we might consider to build a more effective national security, economic security, and climate security matrix in the U.S. government and with the U.S. private sector, we see a couple of things. First of all, we have kind of 5 major policy silos. Like, this is where these policies live, right? But these policies also have their primary objective, which might be secure, clean energy policies, national security policies, climate policies, trade policies, and industrial policies. But they also have impacts on other spheres as well. So things that we might consider for securing our clean energy policies are, a permitting bill, a bill on nuclear fusion, more investment in fuel sources of the future, which would include nuclear fuel innovation security. Probably we need something for hydrogen too. And then allied agreements for things like HALEU processing for advanced nuclear reactors, and transportation agreements with friends and allies who have nuclear fleets like France, Japan, and Canada. In terms of national security policies, we probably need to think about how to more effectively merge and build out our export controls and sanctions. It is certainly very pertinent and an already topic of discussion on the Hill about whether we need an AI bill and need to figure out with the private sector how to effectively harness AI. We should be thinking about what we're doing with government procurement for sensitive inputs. Then, of course, there's critical supply chain. What types of additions to NDAA and NDPA should be considered for critical supply. And then, of course, know your chip bill. Like, what chips and how should we be managing the flow of that critical technology? Should we include foundational chips? Should it only be the higher end nodes, and so on and so forth. Climate policies. We need a credit standard for sequestration. There is no way to build a market if you don't have a credit standard on sequestering carbon and also on what constitutes fungibility of those credits across borders and also domestically. We probably need an e-liability accounting standard in practice so companies can actually put carbon and other pollution factors on the balance sheet. Trade policies. Again, there's some climate stuff in here. A border pollution measures bill or a carbon border adjustment, it would be a really good idea to not just to help the climate, but also to combat predatory environmental noncompliance. We need to be doing that with friends to be effective, it includes carbon club agreements. We need new trade promotion authority so we can actually negotiate those trade agreements with new objectives that matter for our national security, economic security, and climate security. It would be a good idea if we first revised our trade remedy laws because we need more agile and tools with less discretion. We should probably expand the UFPLA to all persons and jurisdictions. Turns out you can take a slave and move them to someplace else outside of Shenzhen. So we have to start thinking about ways that circumvention might happen before we write a bill. Outbound investment, which is very controversial, of course, but we need to think about what we're doing with our dollar abroad and what types of pressure that's creating in our own economy to be presented with false choices between profit and freedom. More critical supply agreements, and ideally ones that have more benefits for the United States, including market access, new FTAs, and TAME, which if you read the book, you'll know stands for Treaty of Allied Market Economies. Industrial policies, national mining strategy, and a critical materials processing bill would be helpful. National recycling and material reclamation bill would help the latter happen. And then finally, a bill on foundational chips, so we have that chips, we have a full value chain around chips. Okay, so these are some of the policies, and these are the silos they live in, but they also have functional purposes, right, that are a little bit different than their policy silos. So, pulled together, this is a strategy. Build, protect, promote. Now, if you're going to be effective in developing these policies, you need the people in those various silos to understand how to work with how to link these policies through their functional purpose inside our system. Finally, or not finally, 2 more slides, guys, we're almost done. There is a critical path on these policies. They're linear. Some things have to happen before other things, right? And so if you want nuclear fuel innovation, you need a permitting bill. If you want processing agreements with partners, you have to have an innovation bill. If you want corporate accounting standards for climate, you really need a credit standard for CCUS. You have to be able to move things across your balance sheet. Otherwise, you're just counting just to count. And if you want carbon border adjustments and carbon club agreements, You need all of those preceding things, plus you need a revision of your trade remedy laws, because you're not going to have comfort to negotiate new agreements until you get your remedy laws in place and businesses feel that they're going to be protected regardless of what the US government is out negotiating. Similarly, you need trade remedy laws before you can get TPA. And same for the outbound investment bill, for Know Your Chip, for government procurement of sensitive inputs, and for revision of export controls and sanctions. You also probably need to do national recycling and reclamation bill before you talk about mining, because it makes mining more palatable if you're making sure that you're mining society first. And you probably need those things before you do trade promotion, because you generally want to have those circular economy policies baked into your trade promotion objectives. You could probably live without it, but it'd be nice. Then you need that TPA before you can negotiate new FTAs, critical supply agreements, and TAME. Okay. Now this is the final slide. All right, so we're in Napa, where bottlenecks are arguably a good thing. But in Washington, bottlenecks are not a good thing, because it prevents us from getting where we need to be. So on the permitting bill, bottlenecks include the perception of environmental harm. We need to be able to be more effective in this communication of how we can do permitting effectively without, that we're cutting time and not environmental efficacy. Similarly, as I mentioned before, the National Recycling and Material Reclamation Bill could help with that. All right. Before you can get that sort of data on harm, you really need to, before you get that recycling bill, we need to know how much is actually in society. We need stocks and society data. And we also need better materials standards and valuation. Those both serve to manage the perception of environmental harm, but also create some market for materials. Carbon Club agreements need that standard. I mentioned that before. Must revise our trade remedy laws before we get any new TPA or trade agreements. Otherwise, we're in a position where we might have to go it alone, and we need to be able to do this with friends and allies. All right, Know Your Chip bill and outbound investment. A lot of questions around what the scope of covered technologies is going to be. What types of chips? How much is too much? How much is too burdensome for businesses to track? Similarly, with outbound investment, what technologies matter? What ones are we willing to let go? And again, if there's questions on outbound investment around extraterritoriality, whether it's even legal. I would argue that since we have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I think if people have rules overseas, capital might need to have rules too, but that's personal opinion. We can just debate this week. And then similarly, if we are not managing our outbound investment in concert with other partners, we're in a position where we go it alone and we can be played. Our interests can be played against us with other parties. We've seen that movie before. Government procurement for sensitive inputs. Government's busy. There's kind of a lack of ambition right now. And of course, both for that and export controls, there are a variety of legal gaps that need to be identified, workshopped, and solved. And again, once we do those things, we really need to think about how we do it with partners, because going it alone is useless. All right. All of these problems can be summarized through cloud problems, which are kind of like emotional, nebulous problems, are divisive threats, technical challenges. We have a few lucky breaks in our deck, and of course, a few wild cards. So on cloud problems, perceived environmental risk, political attention span, it's short. Partners, magical thinking. Our partners, especially abroad, have some very magical thinking about how great the world is. They see the world as they think it should be, not how it is. Divided and distracted public. On divisive threats, NIMBY and banana. Who knows banana? Yes. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, right? So how do we build all this infrastructure we need to build when nobody wants to build anything, but they want the thing, right? Technology preferences and aversion, right? I would argue that there's a lot of people who just like solar, but they can't tell you why, right? I'm technology agnostic. I just want something that's secure and that works, right? And that we control. Vested interest in China. There's a lot of people making their money in China. A lot of banks are heavily invested in China. That creates a conflict of interest. It just does. Technical challenges, standards development. The standards take a long time, and yet they are critical to underpin any sort of infrastructure you want to build an economic system. Scope determination, how much of any given thing are we going to control, how much are we going to let go? Legal and policy gaps, these are all the clock and unlock problems, guys. Infrastructure development timelines, it just takes time to build things, right? And even if you have magical permitting, it takes time. And are we going to be able to beat the clock on that? And workforce development. I heard workforce at least 3 times yesterday. It does keep me up late. I'm not a workforce person, but it keeps me up late at night. Are we going to have the skills and technical ability to service the workforce of the future when we have already decided that we don't want to do immigration and half of Americans graduating high school are functionally illiterate? Lucky breaks. There's a bipartisan consensus on trade. Post-IRA and chips, there's more ambition. I usually, when Congress does something, they kind of, just tip their cap and they're like, we did a thing. I think there's now an understanding that more is more. Massive investments in the U.S. government and a talented workforce. Wild cards, unknown. We don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. We don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. election. We don't know actually what's happening in the mind of President Xi, President Putin, the Ayatollah of Iran. We don't know what their timelines look like, and we don't really have a true understanding of their ambitions. We can only guess. All right. Let's crush this, guys. Thank you.
How you doing?